Not even a trip to the Pentagon to honor the victims of 9/11 on this solemn anniversary slowed the president's steady stream of complaints and attacks today. Most of those grievances aired on his Twitter feed, where he came positively undone about a fresh round of head-to-head polls that show him losing to nearly a half a dozen Democrats. But he also found time in an Oval Office meeting to insult his newly departed third national security advisor and to go after the press for revealing that the attacks on the Weather Service that corrected Trump's erroneous Alabama forecast came from the president and his chief of staff.
That's a whole hoax by the fake news media when they talk about the hurricane and when they talk about Florida and they talk about Alabama. That's just fake news. It was right from the beginning. It was a fake story.
And you know what that means, real as can be. But it's those polls that show Donald Trump's political standing may be reaching a low point that's leading to a presidential unraveling. Here are those polls. Donald Trump loses to Joe Biden in head-to-head polling by 15 points. Donald Trump loses to Bernie Sanders by 9 points. Donald Trump losing to Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris by 7 points. And Donald Trump loses to Mayor Pete Buttigieg, should he be the nominee, by 4 points. The head-to-head polls reflecting what the latest presidential approval number reveals, that Trump's squandered summer has taken a toll. He's slumped 6 points and is back in the 30s, nearing his lowest approval rating ever. Washington Post notes, quote, "For Trump, the current standings represent a troubling threat. No president in modern times has been reelected with approval ratings as low as Trump's are today." And that is where we start with some of our favorite reporters and friends. With us from the New York Times, White House correspondent Annie Carney, NBC News correspondent Heidi Presbella, with us in Houston, MSNBC correspondent Garrett Hake, and at the table, Charlie Sykes, editor-in-chief of the conservative news and opinion website The Bulwark, and Eddie Glaude, chair of the Center for African American Studies at Princeton University. Let me start with you, Annie Carney. There are what Eli Stokols calls presidential tells. And one of them is sort of his inability to restrain himself. And it's almost one of those obliterated norms that we're so used to it barely registers. But I don't have any recollection of any past president using this anniversary and sort of between events, which Donald Trump did attend to honor the anniversary of 9/11, firing off tweets, attacking the press, attacking the polls, and attacking his rivals on his Twitter feed and in that Oval Office meeting we showed.
Well, yes. I mean, we've seen him fire off tweets and when he's traveling abroad on foreign soil, picking political fights at home. This is a somber day of remembrance, and Trump had events, and on Twitter we see where his mind really is, which is on this poll. These kinds of events, when it calls for bringing a nation together and remembering and healing, have never been something that he feels comfortable with. Fighting on Twitter about polls is more naturally where he tends to be. One thing that struck me about his tweet was the statement that he said, "I haven't even started campaigning," which that was what stood out to me the most there. First of all, he had a kickoff rally in Orlando in June, which felt funny at the time because it was a kickoff to a campaign that had never really stopped for the past 2 years. He's been campaigning the whole time. He launched his reelection campaign days after his inauguration. And more and more we see official White House events looking indistinguishable from campaign events. Yesterday he gave a speech about HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities. He talked about how he would poll with African American voters, and sympathy for the devil, his campaign song, played as he left the stage. So it seems like everything is a campaign event. So that really struck me, that he says, "I haven't even started." He's never stopped.
That's such a good point. And what's so amazing is that, Axios had the schedules, and Annie, you and your colleagues have done extensive reporting and do on a near daily basis, that there's no governing on his schedule ever. There's an occasional photo op to lend the appearance to governing, but there's no actual governing that happens at this point, for better or for worse. I mean, his critics may be relieved to hear that.
I mean, his schedule is a fluid thing where he sits in the Oval or in the dining room off the Oval and watches TV and calls people in as they come. And and policy making does not have a structured process and is done on the fly. But yeah, what he understands is a head-to-head political fights, and that's what he has ahead of him. And everything, many battles that or policies are about, especially right now, are about his reelection.
Garrett Haake, I think that what is revealed in this round of head-to-heads and in some of the sinking approval ratings is that it blows out of the water this idea that that nothing matters to his base. That may be true with the base, but the base isn't 44% of America. It's somewhere south of 38% of Americans. And certainly his conduct and the idea that sort of the Mueller cloud has been replaced by an almost darker cloud of corruption and incompetence, that has sent his poll numbers to some of the lowest of his presidency.
Yeah, I mean, you look at those numbers coming out of Texas, and I would largely discount a lot of the head-to-head numbers. This is before a dime has been spent on advertising in a general election that I think we all realize is probably going to be one of the most negative general elections any of us have ever seen or witnessed. But if you look around at what the president's numbers are in Texas,
way to get me
stagnant.
excited.
No. Get everybody tune in. No, look, I mean, the president's numbers are stagnant even in a place like Texas for a number of reasons. I mean, he's completely turned off the suburban voters in this state. I mean, in Harris County, suburban Houston, where I am right now, all the Dallas suburbs, we started to see this in 2018 when a lot of these seats flipped to the Democrats. We're going to see more of those probably flipping in 2020 with all these Republican retirements that we've seen around the state here. And a lot of the key issues, the drums that President Trump likes to bang on, don't play that well in Texas. On trade, this is a state that is enormously dependent on trade. The trade war hurts here on a state that has been essentially bulletproof through the recession of the last 10 years. You know, Texas has gotten through that just fine, but the trade war makes people nervous here. And the immigration rhetoric doesn't work here either. Texans, no Mexicans. That is our next door neighbor here. The rhetoric has there's just a complete divorce between the rhetoric the president uses about immigration and what Texans, including Republicans and independents, see and feel every day. So yes, I think the border crisis, the images of kids in cages in Texas cities is far more damaging to President Trump among the voters he would like to reach here than anything about Mueller or Russia or how he got elected in 2016 ever was or would be.
And for anyone listening in their car, while you were talking, Garrett, I put up the Texas approval rating, which is upside down. Donald Trump at only 45% approval, 50% disapproval. I want to ask you about guns. I can't believe I'm about to utter this sentence, but over the summer, you covered 2 mass shootings in the state of Texas. How has the gun issue changed, if at all, in the state of Texas?
It's really interesting. Number one, we're seeing the Democratic voters across the country are now saying this is the most important issue to them. In Texas, the shooting in El Paso and then again in Odessa got a ton of news coverage here locally, even beyond what we were talking about nationally. You saw the governor of the state convene these panels to discuss it. Not a lot has come from that so far, but Texans have been super dialed in on it. I interviewed 4 of the Democrats who are running to be the candidate to take on John Cornyn in the Senate here next year. All of them had far more progressive gun control policies than I think you would have ever seen in the state of Texas. 3 out of the 4 said they were in favor of mandatory buybacks for assault weapons. Everybody is on board with universal background checks. That would have gotten you thrown out of events here in the state of Texas 6 years ago, maybe 4 years ago. You saw a little bit with the Beto O'Rourke campaign for Senate in 2018, pushing the limits on that a little bit in the Senate race here. The conversation has flipped dramatically in a state that has more guns than any other state, but where responsible gun owners even are saying this doesn't work the way we have this set up now.
Heidi, how is that impacting the debate in Congress? I mean, it would seem that Democrats who have been frustrated. I mean, President Obama put the entire weight of his presidency behind gun control after the tragedy at Newtown, and nothing happened. But it would seem that if it's the Parkland kids becoming activists and sort of looking at the grown-ups in the room like, WTF, or if it's just the crush and the pace and the clip of mass shootings, or if it's parents looking around at their kids when they come back from preschool having active shooter drills, it feels like the political tide is turning in favor of gun control efforts.
Does feel like there is a shift in intensity, Nicole. I was there after Newtown covering that gun control debate, and actually the first thing to happen that was the rationale for that legislation was the fact that red state Democrats were so scared that they wouldn't support it. And so then it was hard for Democrats to then go to even moderate Republicans and get them on board with the legislation because the fear of the NRA and the backlash was so pervasive. You flash forward now to where the groundswell of activism is really, the intensity is really on the side of the gun safety community. Is it Moms Demand Action? Yes. Is it the Parkland students? Yes. They are all making their voices heard. And it is also the public, which is starting to shift as well on issues like the assault weapons ban, which has been expired for decades now. And I just talked to actually a prominent Democratic senator last night, Nicole, who's been working on this gun issue. And he says that a number of Republicans have privately approached him because they are scared. They want the president to bring something forward on background check. They're worried about their own political hides. And so the question is whether the president is going to show leadership here, because Mitch McConnell has made clear he's not putting anything on the floor that the president won't sign. And this president, after every massacre, seems to have a familiar pattern where he flirts and says that he's going to do background checks, and then the NRA gets a hold of him, shakes him back into obedience, and he pulls back.
I don't think they shake very hard, Charlie. It's still galling, though, and I believe every word that Heidi's reporting. But what they're afraid of is their political fate. They're not galled, or they don't publicly speak about being galled by the clip of killings of innocents.
Well, I mean, there's no question about it. This is a real problem for Republicans that have to run in suburban districts. But the fundamental dynamics of the politics have not changed, because Donald Trump is going to run a base-only election. And I think that he's afraid, and he's being told that this would rattle his base. Look, take those head-to-head national poll numbers for what they're worth, but also notice that in those swing states that he won from Hillary Clinton, those numbers are much, much closer. This election is not going to be decided in California. It's not going to be decided in New York. It's going to be decided in places like Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. And this issue will play differently there in some of those areas.
You don't see it shifting? You don't see it shifting?
Oh,
I mean, you got gun owners in favor of background checks. You got gun owners overwhelmingly in favor of red flag laws. And
they always have been. But there is this fear of going up against that hardcore, intense base that the NRA represents. Now, I mean, we could be shocked by Donald Trump, but Donald Trump so far has not allowed any daylight between himself and the NRA, the hardliners on all of this. And if he doesn't move, the Republican Party is not going to move on all of this, and then I think they're going to pay a huge price at the polls.
I think to focus just on Donald Trump's weakness would be a mistake. This is also about the strength of the Democratic field.
Absolutely.
You've got 5 candidates from Joe Biden, who just crushes Donald Trump in a national. And I understand the limitations of national head-to-head numbers. I've touted them when it's been my candidate on top, and I've dismissed them when it's been my candidate on the bottom. But the truth is, indicators are indicators, and the indicator is that at least 5 Democrats beat Donald Trump handily.
And you know, Nicole, I think what it does is it allows us to put aside, at least for a moment, the question of electability as a way of determining who we should support in the Democratic field, because usually, at least the argument in the preseason has been Biden is the one who can beat Trump. Well, now we have evidence, at least the polls have been consistent, to show that at least 5, 6 people can beat Trump. And so the question then becomes, what next? What ought we to consider, right? Do we need to consider where they stand on health care? Do we need to consider where they stand on immigration? How far left are they going? Where are they centrist? Where do they stand in the internal debate within the party? That's the second question. Then the third issue, I think, all of this boils down to turnout. It's going to be a base election. We know what really is going to matter here is whether or not Democrats can bring those folks who aren't voting to the polls, and whether or not Donald Trump can expand his base, where he can get those rural voters to come out in massive numbers. And this is what we saw in the North Carolina special election. We saw Donald Trump come down, generate some excitement, and then we saw all of these folks show up. And it had an impact, even with regards to those suburban voters who had turned their nose against Donald Trump. And this is key. His strategy, at least it seems to me, is to expand his base those white voters who don't vote, who are disaffected, and who appealed to, who he appeals to by way of some of the ugly things.
And the other thing, though, and Garrett mentioned how negative this campaign is going to be, Donald Trump knows he doesn't have to win this election. He has to have the Democrats lose it. He has to make them more toxic than he is. He's got to have, in 2016, among voters who hated both candidates, they broke heavily for him. I think you're going to have a big chunk of voters who are going to dislike both candidates by Election Day on 2020. And so the question is, can Donald Trump run a negative enough campaign to paint the Democrats as more of a threat to the Republic than he is? And I think that that's going to be at the heart of his strategy.
Annie Carney, you and your colleagues in the paper and on your Twitter feeds are pretty expert at sort of deciphering Donald Trump. And I've seen a lot of notes in the last sort of 36 hours about how to tell what really bothers him. And it would appear that when it came to John Bolton, it had less to do with policy differences. And other than loving Putin and wanting to have the Taliban at Camp David, I'm not sure what policy Donald Trump has really staked out as near and dear to himself. But he's mad about the idea or the allegation or the belief that Bolton leaked about him. And when it comes to these polls, I think that it's been pointed out to me that he's aware of his weak political standing at the moment, but it's the coverage of the polls that so enrages him. And same with the Democrats, that he's not convinced that socialism wouldn't sell to some elements of his base, maybe some working class white men that he counts on, that he's not convinced that wouldn't be a popular message, that all of it is sort of stagecraft, that none of it at this point means much of anything to this president.
Someone made the point that I think is a really good one, that if you want to think about who Donald Trump is most afraid of in terms of the Democratic field, it's whoever they are talking about on TV the most in that moment. That so much of how he thinks is reacting to coverage, and it always is. You brought up the Bolton thing. The final straw, according to our reporting, was that Bolton appeared to try to sort of leak that he had disagreed with Trump about the meeting at Camp David with the Taliban, and also leaked this idea that Pence had agreed with him and not the president. This was the final straw. The leaking, the appearing in public to break with the president or contradict him. But yeah, he's watching how these people are playing. In terms of the campaign, the campaign operatives who are seasoned to some degree still believe that Biden would be the biggest challenge for them in the race, the hardest candidate to make the socialism argument against, the one who could most appeal to some of Trump's base and take that away from him. So yes, the polls show that all of the candidates are beating him now, and Biden obviously would not have the same grassroots appeal among Democratic voters, and who's to say he gets out the same kind of vote Elizabeth Warren would. But from the Trump campaign's perspective, he'd be the most, he still is mentioned to me most as the hardest challenger for Trump.
Because he threatens that coalition.
He threatens to appeal to the same kind of voters that Trump appeals to.
All right, we have some breaking.
Also,
go ahead, Annie. Go ahead. No.
I was just going to make one more point about the negatives. Sorry, in terms of trying to drag his opponent's negatives or drive them up, he will never have an opponent whose negatives are as high as Hillary Clinton's were. That was a unique race where both candidates were really, both had like upside down numbers. Both were really disliked, and both voters had strong opinions of both of them that were hard and fast, and it was hard to change those. He will not have an opponent where there is a view quite like there was of Hillary Clinton.
All right, I'm going to act out that breaking news graphic. Dun, dun, dun. Breaking news we're learning this hour. The Trump administration will not grant temporary protected status to people from the Bahamas displaced by Hurricane Dorian. The news comes as authorities there announce that there are now at least 2,500 people missing, 2,500 people as a result of Hurricane Dorian. NBC News' Julia Ainsley is here with more. Julia, I've watched your reporting yesterday on Morning Joe and other places, and it would appear that the worst case scenario for the victims of this hurricane has come to pass. Tell us about it.
It is, Nicole. So temporary protected status has been granted at this point to 10 countries. There are over 300,000 people in the United States now with temporary protected status. They've left things like Haiti's 2010 earthquake, and they're allowed to live here and work here until the U.S. deems it safe to return to their country. The U.S., looking at this damage here, has determined that this does not qualify for that kind of status.
How is that possible? I mean, I'm just looking at these pictures while you're talking. How is that possible, Julia?
It's not that it doesn't compare to some of the devastation that we've seen elsewhere. It's that this administration has a completely different way of looking at temporary protected status. It's something that people like Stephen Miller have been trying to crack down on for a while. There have been people, different groups that they have revoked temporary protected status to, even though they know the conditions and they aren't given the advice and the reports that show that the conditions have changed at all. They will still revoke this temporary protected status. What they do have is a way for people from the Bahamas to come here temporarily on visas. That is, if they can find their passports and visas in the middle of all of this destruction, they can come to the United States temporarily, but that's very temporary and they cannot work. A temporary protected status would allow someone really to stay in the country for years, sometimes 10 or 15 years. We've seen people stay and they really plug into the community and almost become like Americans after they leave those countries. That will not be granted to the people from this place, which is devastating for them. If they're going to try to wait out however long it takes for the recovery of such devastation, they're going to need to be able to work in order to do that. And right now, the United States is saying that the State Department will not be authorizing or requesting temporary protected status on their behalf.
It's unbelievable. Garrett, you said a couple minutes ago that the immigration issue cuts differently in Texas. I mean, I don't think that warning or scaring or fear-mongering about people from the Bahamas sounds like a particularly winning message in any battleground state, let alone in Texas. Is this the kind of sort of overreach on a topic like immigration that you're hearing on the campaign trail may have gone too far for some voters?
We'll have to wait and see. I wonder if something like this just becomes part of the drip, drip, drip of whatever the latest sort of off-the-wall thing from the White House is that people start to tune out. It is wholly consistent with every other restrictionist immigration policy that this president has made. I have a hard time imagining that any Democrat or Democrat-leaning voter who didn't think the president's immigration policies were crazy before would look at this and think, aha, perhaps this is the moment he's gone too far. But it is fully in line with what Democrats have said is essentially a totally heartless immigration policy. And I'm sure we'll hear more about it from the Democratic candidates.
I mean, Eddie, I guess the difference is no one in the Bahamas was trying to come here.
Right.
Their homes were obliterated. I mean, the pictures that we're showing, it looks like a nuclear blast. So the difference between sort of the bucket of cruel and incompetently executed immigration policies is that no one from the Bahamas was trying to come here for a better life. They were happy in the Bahamas by and large, but they are now homeless because their homes have been wiped out.
So politics aside, this is evil. This is cruel. Any idea of the country as kind of this a moral beacon to the world? This contradicts it quite clearly, right?
This is what made America great, is that we were always there at moments like this.
Well, not for black people.
Well, exactly, because, and I'm going to apologize in advance for this, Donald Trump thinks of the Bahamas as a shithole country. And he doesn't want people from those countries to come here. And so, yeah, it's hard. It is hard to escape that because it is the callousness, it is the cruelty, it is the unchristian attitude.
About to say that,
we asked this, where are the Christians on all this? But a certain point is, what is your Christianity? If you look at those pictures and say, we are not there for you, we are not going to provide some sort of assistance for you. So it's un-American, it's un-Christian, and unfortunately, I do think that there will be people who will be disgusted by this. I don't know how many people will be disgusted by it, but you're right, And
I think at the same time, Charlie, there will be a whole bunch of people who won't.
Yeah.
And we need to ask ourselves the question, what does that say about who we are? Because that's cruel. That's not only cruel, that's evil.